talking about weaving discussions around resilience into MBA programs. Because guess what? Business continuity in the face of large-scale disruption has been year over year one of the top risks in the Alliance Risk Barometer, or I forget the name of it. You guys would know it. Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. Survey of business leaders. Or disaster management into urban planning, or public health, educational techniques into emergency management, etc. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you.
So I think my follow-up, the thing that really kind of got me to almost jump out of my chair there was the question on how, on building in that whole community approach. And I think that what neither side has really taken ownership of, and by side I mean academia or practitioners, is the boring part of all of this, right? When somebody asks, you know, and I remember after a couple of disasters in New York, people ask, well, why couldn't you just get this here? And the answer is usually not, well, because we didn't feel like it. It usually has something to do with some sort of financial constraint or regulatory constraint, important regulatory constraint that stands in the way. And so when it comes to public-private partnerships, the problem is government isn't built to have public-private partnerships. Government is built to protect from public-private coordination in that way. And so then suddenly it's disaster time. So, you know, private sector companies can't just, you know, give gifts to government. But then suddenly when there's a disaster, we need private companies to be providing to communities a bunch of things for free. Or not for free, but in some sort of mechanism, in some sort of way. And so academia, when answering the question, they'll say, they'll come up with something and say, hey, we did a study on grocery stores, and we realized that grocery stores are providing most of the resilience. Okay, well, how does government get that information? That's the question. And I think that when you start to convene groups and have conversations, you've got to look at it from the answer is you've got to look at it from a whole change management perspective. What's my problem? What's my solution? Now, what's going to stand in the way of my solution? What are my pain points, you would say, in the consulting world? You know, how is society going to feel about it? That could be a pain point. Is there the financial infrastructure, the regulatory infrastructure to make that happen? That's a potential pain point. Are there inherent, so, you know, one concrete example is when we were talking about integrating law enforcement and EMS, the issue wasn't that they didn't know how to walk in a diamond formation into a building. The issue was that they had 20 years of bias and experience that taught them that that's just not how you do it. And you know, EMS had 20 years of experience saying, we don't go into dangerous situations. Well, really? You've not gone into a house where there's an injury caused by a domestic dispute that you didn't know was a domestic dispute until you got there? Of course you do. But you have to think through the things that are going to stand in the way of the solution when you're framing that solution. It's something that we're starting to work pretty concretely with the atmospheric sciences folks here about is when you're saying, why are these new forecast models not finding their way into agencies, or why are meteorologists not finding their way into these agencies? There are real reasons, and it's, again, not just because people don't feel like it. I think if academia wants to push its ideas out, it needs to engage in that conversation as well across disciplines.
Which is what we're trying to do here at this conference, to connect these communities, to find ways of working together, to develop some common vocabulary, some common understandings, or complementary understandings. At this point, I think, why don't we try to bring the audience into the conversation. And so we're very happy to take some questions about what are some of the challenges that are facing, what are some of the things keeping you up at night, what are some of the ideas that you have about ways that the universities could engage or engage more effectively to partner in dealing with these issues more effectively. So I don't know if I don't think we have a floor microphone, so I would just ask you to stand up and project your voices so we can hear you. So the floor is open if anybody would like to ask a question. Yes.
So you did Tom finish up with the National Park Service at Department of Interior. Okay, that was a frog in my throat, evidently. So this is just a comment. There was a comment made about, I think it was David, about academia and government kind of in the same place with regard to relevance of science and information that they're getting out. And this is probably relevant a couple of times already today. But as a platform for connecting government and academia, as an example that I'm aware of within the National Council on Science and the Environment, there's what's called the Committee of Environmental Deans and Directors. I don't know the size of that group or the composition and how much it changes over time, but it's leaders from academic institutions that are in the area of environment, whether that's natural resources or environmental quality, whatever it is. Seems to me there could be, if there isn't already, and I don't know NCE's structure, if there isn't a body like that already for this particular subject matter area, that would be perhaps low-hanging fruit to establish. And then you'd have that organization behind it, and then you could recruit the right folks to sit on a committee like that. Just as an example of something that already exists, you could morph for your own topic.
Just a couple of quick reflections, and I'll pass the questions on to the panel. I think there are a number of different efforts that are looking at part of the problem. The Colorado Hazard Center is trying to bring together research and practice in this area, and doing so relatively effectively. The FEMA Higher Education Program, which was brought up in a previous panel, is doing some very, very interesting things. And we have Wendy Walsh, who's the program manager, coming tomorrow. And she's quite an amazing connector, part through sheer force of personality. But I don't know that we have an integrated, overarching connector of the kind that you're describing yet in this space. There's one other thing that I could call to your attention, a relatively new initiative called Impact 360, which is aiming at connecting researchers and practitioners more effectively, coming up with new pedagogics of communication across that divide. All of these things, I think, and like RISE itself, are important moves in the right direction. But let's see what take the panel has on your big point.
Just the only other thing I would add to your list is there are roundtables at the academies that function sort of in the way that you're describing, but they don't have the anointment, for lack of a better word, of a structure that you articulate. Although I'm not particularly familiar with the committee that you referred to. I'm interested. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, I would add, I think that there are national level discussions that probably unfold in that way. At the state level, I mean, I think you can almost have more of an impact, because sometimes the solutions are a little easier, maybe, to address. So I think the challenge is the value proposition of bringing busy people with, important people with busy jobs together to peel off part of their day to focus on this. And I think the enlightened leaders get it, but a lot of folks are in those positions not because they want to be in charge of emergency management, they're elected leaders or they're appointed in some capacity, but they find themselves in these positions and they get overwhelmed by the job, just the sheer volume of it. I know, we've had numerous projects that are great, a lot of fanfare, great ideas, and you just get overwhelmed by the day. I mean, literally, we can't do a day without some crisis that happens. So trying to make time for that is challenging, but I think it's easier if there's a formal process and structure to plug into rather than an ad hoc approach. I like the notion of it, and I would like to see something maybe that's the state level that do that. I think would be really thoughtful.
And I think what I would do when putting that together, and Terry, you hit on it with the value proposition, is I think we bring together a lot of groups in a lot of areas to talk about things and come up with ideas. Starting to bring those groups together for specific, actionable, measurable outcomes. Bring a group together to talk about something that's going to result in a training course, as Terry was talking about before, or a specific policy, or something tangible where it's easier to quantify how it's worth people's time, and it's easier to do what's hard in this field because we're usually planning for stuff that we hope doesn't happen, to actually measure its benefit. That's an easier way to get funding for it. That's a better way to get people's time for it. It's got to be measurable and it's got to be actionable.
I would just add different situations, different government agencies, different timetables. They have different ways they have to operate. So we would sometimes, when I was at the FCC, meet informally with public interest groups. Occasionally there was an academic involved also. And this was before we would do a rulemaking, before we would make a policy judgment, and it would inform the questions that we would ask and that we would put out for comment. But we were only by law, statute, constitution, able to choose what rules to adopt and what policies to adopt on an on-the-record notice and comment rulemaking. And when it came to that stage, the academics went missing. And they didn't put their information into the public record, their opinions into the public record, so that the FCC could go beyond the stage of being informed and asking intelligent questions with good ideas, but actually use the information from academics to rely on it in making policy decisions. And, you know, just to sort of back this up, I've been in that role. In Sandy, I slept on an air mattress on the floor in my office. When Sandy hit, I didn't know whether I could get in because the Potomac might overflow the next day. We were on the phones to the governor's office in New Jersey trying to get fuel depots okayed for cell phone carriers to refuel in New York City where cell towers were, cell sites were going down to try to keep things up. So we became sort of de facto advocates for the public and the industry really to try to keep communications going. But when you think about what keeps me up at night, it's way before that. It's my frustration that we could make our infrastructure more resilient and avoid pieces of the crises we face if we are intelligent and we make disclosures and we assure accountability beforehand. I wanted to use the marketplace, not really regulatory authority. I wanted to put just information out there, transparency, as Professor Stern said, because I knew that it would have a tremendous effect on the investments that companies would choose to make. And that is a heck of a lot more powerful, the marketplace really, than I would have been as a regulator. So by just trying to get that transparency, we could have gotten a lot better resilience in our telecommunications networks and still could. And so what keeps me up at night is that you talk about low-hanging fruit. This isn't low-hanging because, you know, it's powerful companies and they don't want to disclose this. They feel it's their choice, their information. But they're incredibly concentrated and they are critical infrastructure in the United States, and we have to have an honest conversation about what comes with that when it relates to public safety. They do a great job in terms of public-private partnerships. Those are tending to be the people in the middle of the company and lower down who have the heart and the commitment in emergencies to, you know, work as hard as they can to deliver cows and colts, which are sell on wheels, sell on light trucks, to places where it's needed. They work endlessly. They're wonderful people. But you know what? The decisions on budget, on resiliency, on policy are made way above them. And so it's always frustrating to them because they talk to us and sometimes we're a little frustrated. And they say, my God, I'm doing everything I can. And they are. But the system that we've got and the management above them and the choices that are made, nobody's accountable for it. That's what keeps me up at night when we're not doing as well as we could, and there are easy solutions to that will impact us way before we get to the emergency, you know, that we have to respond to.
Thank you, David. So, more questions. Liza?
Okay, I live in Sonoma County, and as we've been sitting here, I just got a notice on my phone that PG&E is going to again turn my electricity off before I get home. So I'd like to invite the panel to get a little more up close and personal in in the sense of exactly what disclosures should I, as a PG&E ratepayer, ask for? Am I likely to get out of the frying pan into the fire if we try and socialize the utility, because so many of our government agencies don't work very well already? If we quote privatize or take away from PG&E our local electricity, is it going to be worse? We certainly aren't going to have as much capital to invest. If we talk about education and educating somebody, it's great to educate graduate students, but the voters and the public and the people who become the disaster survivors need the education as well. And how are we going to communicate with them so that we as public and voters know who to support and have a better way of articulating our needs and hopefully our solutions?
While the panel ponders that, Liza, I just want to recognize you for some of the work that you have been doing with recovers.org, which is a resource for people in a community to guide them in terms of connecting with different types of resources to facilitate recovery. It's exactly the kind of bottom-up, grassroots-driven, technology-enabled solution that I think fits very well with the spirit of RISE. So maybe you'd like to say a word or two about that as well.
I'd like to say 2 URLs so you can investigate it for yourself. If you want to read about the organization behind the recovers.org platform, go to srcinternational.org, and that I actually put it on the communication system, so you can get it if you have the app. And the platform, the main domain for the platform that we're using is recovers, with an S, recovers.org, and any community on the globe can open a local subdomain for their local preparedness. We don't do first responder work only, and we don't collect money. It's preparedness and long-term recovery. We do put members of the public in touch with each other, and the backbone is the recovery agencies. So the one I've been working on is Sonoma County as one word, recovers, SonomaCounty.recovers.org, and see me later if you want more. I can demonstrate everybody else. But I'm also personally involved because I've now been evacuated twice. Luckily, the flood that we had in February 2 years.
So very different types of weather extremes there coming in from both sides. So would you kind of like to comment on either of those two components?
Actually, this goes back to the early days when I was with New York City Emergency Management, when some of the people on this panel weren't even born. But one of the great questions is that the greatest burden government has is taking care of its population. And there's a notion in government, and I think we're all friends, so I'll just share it, I hope it doesn't leave this room, is that government just can't do this. And it's demonstrated it, but it's never said that it could. It was just an assumption. The more we have people who know how to take care of themselves, the less they have a reliance on government. And as a result of that, then the resources of government go to the real tragedies in disasters. But it also prevents disasters by people knowing what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. So the amount of money that we spend in preparation for first responders, and I'll never spend, there's never been a dime that hasn't been spent worthwhile on first responders, we could also channel to our population. CERT is a good example. When CERT is applied equitably in a jurisdiction, when the whole community gets involved, not just part of the community. But that's the major step forward, is making sure that the people on your block, your neighborhood, your friends, your family know how to take care of themselves. My wife, who has this tendency to remind me that are not perfect in this field, has asked me repeatedly, how much food do we have in the garage? And so this is the first time in 25 years I have 72 hours worth of food and water. But it's taken how many years before I decided I had to do that? Where are people who are not in this field and what are they faced with? So you're absolutely correct. If we can get a population who's aware of their vulnerabilities, aware of what their resources are, and aware of their qualifications, by giving them the tools to do it, they become less of a burden, and they, in fact, don't get hurt.
I don't have a great answer for you. It's a valid question, but I will say there's strength in numbers. I sort of think back to the Flint, Michigan situation where ultimately the impacted population held that community accountable. I mean, if you sort of left government to their own devices, I don't know if that would have turned out the same way. And I think now more than ever, you're seeing sort of this advocacy, grassroots type approach to things, and people are paying attention to that stuff. That's tough to organize. Someone's got to take the lead, or people are going to be willing to jump into the fray on that. But it's just interesting to me when I see these sort of grassroots level organizations, whether it's Black Lives Matter or these other groups that can really impact change at a pretty significant level by people just saying, we've had enough and we're going to do something about it. So again, not a great answer, just I guess an observation.
So since I've already been tacitly attacked as the millennial on the panel, I'll give the millennial answer. And that's, I think we have to engage in where people are going for this information, and one of those is social media. Terry has been working on, and I've jumped onto this effort to get students at Albany working with state Homeland Security on its social media communication, both looking at trends across social media and analyzing the outreach. That sounds like a great piece of information to put on social media, just as an emergency manager, to say, hey, we're here to help, here's your resource. And to sort of take back this space of making government and ultimately academia the place where you go for this type of information, rather than to, your friend Jerry, who posted something of, moderate helpfulness on Twitter yesterday that gets you fired up. So, I think that's one tool that emergency managers can use and have to use and get ahead of.
I'm not an expert in what's going on in California in the sense of, the electric company, but unlike the cellular service, where states and local governments are expressly barred from regulating it, and it's only the federal government who has the power to do it, the electric service in most states is regulated by the State Public Utility Commission. And so I just don't know enough about what they've done or not done or said or not said. But they are the ones who I think have had regulatory authority over those companies for a long time.
That's right, and they're the same people who are, unfortunately, the California Public Utilities Commission has not regulated
And I don't know what they've done or not, so I don't want to, I'm just sort of pointing out where authority is as opposed to criticizing or recommending. And the other thing I would say about communications, there are different kinds of communications at different times. There's preparation that people have been talking about, but we have a new tool this month, a refined tool, and that's wireless emergency alerts, which we've had before. But now, as of, I believe, November 1st, the cell companies are required to deliver wireless emergency alerts within 1/10 of a mile accuracy. So it allows emergency managers to provide, and the number of characters has been increased to 360. So it allows critical information to be delivered by emergency managers in a very targeted fashion and at more length than previously to inform people of what to do in an emergency. In the 2017 wildfires in California, Lake County, which is a smaller county, used wireless emergency alerts and nobody died. At that point, though, the targeted area was much bigger. Sonoma County decided not to use it because they couldn't, they said, pinpoint the area to a small enough area to give instructions, and they were afraid there'd be a panic. And a lot of people died in Sonoma County in 2017. I'm hopeful that emergency authorities in California will make use of the wireless emergency alerts new capabilities as of this month. Now, there's always the possibility in fires that the cell towers are unavailable and so they can't transmit. But that hasn't always been the problem. It's been the choice of California emergency authorities based on the lack of targeting that used to be characteristic of wireless emergency alerts, but which is no longer characteristic. And I'm hoping that tool is going to be used around the country by emergency authorities to do a lot of good.
Thank you, David. I think we have time for one more question. I see a hand in the back.
Hi, I'm Kara Voss from the Center for Western Weather and Water Streams at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And this isn't really a question, but it's more of a comment, and I wanted to share an example of one of those academic and government partnerships and what that can look like in a way that's successful. So we are a research center at Scripps, and we have had a lot of success working with water managers in California, a lot in Sonoma County and Mendocino Lake, as well as in a few other areas, trying to incorporate meteorological forecasts into reservoir operations. And we have this structure where we have, for our forecast-informed reservoir operations, we have a steering committee that has representatives from local, federal, and regional agencies, water agencies, as well as other government agencies like the Army Corps, as well as academics, and a few consultants who have a lot of experience in water management. And then behind them, we have the researchers who are doing everything from very applied research, trying to answer specific questions that are necessary to get the deliverables for the project, down to really basic research on things that might be important in the future and could improve our forecasts to better implement this in other reservoirs. And so that's a way that we can we build really strong relationships with, for example, the Sonoma County Water Agency and the local agencies that we work with, and that allows us to have really strong partnerships there to make it a really resilient kind of project. And then our funding is quite resilient because we have state support and federal support and local support. And then even though this is more from a resilience perspective for the water system in California, we also in cases of emergencies like the wildfires, we're able to provide small amounts of support in terms of meteorological information to the residents, and they're used to getting some reliable information out of us. So it's a trusted source. And so if you're looking for academic government partnerships, that seems to be a structure that works really well. And I also wanted to make a plea in the discussion about sharing of information between private sector and government, and to just make a plea to incorporate academics into that, because it's not so easy for us sometimes to find information from the private sector, just as it's not so easy for governments to find that. And if we have that information, we're able to use it in ways that we can provide deliverables to our projects.
I want to thank you for a hopeful example and also for reminding us to keep academics in the loop. We definitely need that. One more question here.
Thank you. My name is also Rodriguez. I represent the Caribbean Preparedness and Response, which is a not-for-profit organization in the aftermath of Maria in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, looking specifically at the communication sector. In Puerto Rico right now, everybody's looking at alternative power, water, and these other, but very little attention is being paid to communications. We're trying to build a network of centers that will have certain capabilities, and most of all, we provide training on protocols and procedures, how to work with, how to work in a disaster. We have met with some international organizations that are been assisting us. We also met with the Federal Communications Commission, which has invited us to come in and discuss our concept to see how we can get in a multi-agency meetings, some support for this effort. My question to the group is is there a model, like the young lady just mentioned, in the communications area that we can follow? How can we approach that? The reason I'm here is that we're looking at universities to partner with us, because as we have a concept already that we're working on, we want to, continue developing it. We want to know best practices, what is working out there, what doesn't work. We have our own experience in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, but we want to know other experiences out there. So in these, with the universities and the government, what do you recommend that we do so that we can advance this effort in the right direction? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're basically out of time. I'd like to give each panelist about 30 seconds to address that question, particularly David, in the communication space. I hope that, give Tracy, I hope that you will touch on that. And we'll need to wrap up. And I hope that we can continue the conversation about the academic practitioner, citizen partnership and communications after the session. Let's start with Dave Kaufman and move across the final words.
So I would just summarize with a simple reminder that especially when we're trying to encourage change, what you pay attention to grows, right? And that applies to your children or your peers as much as it does to organizational change. But we can make a lot of progress simply by finding leading edge practice in whatever direction we think is important and highlighting it and bringing it from the fringe of the conversation to the center. Excuse me. And so I would encourage us to look for those opportunities so that it stops being the fringe and we start to generate peer-driven pressure to sustain that momentum. Wow, so-and-so's doing that? Maybe I should think about it. That's a very different reaction than when someone tells you what you should be doing from an outside organization or frame. So there's a lot of power in that, and events like this are an exceptional opportunity for setting that agenda and bringing those examples to the center. And so I would just leave us with that as an instrument that every single person here can act on. Because never in human history has a single person had as loud a voice as they do today.
Thanks for your question. I don't know of an organization that would fit the bill, but if you are connected to the FCC, they are very resourceful, and you might ask them that question, and they can play a powerful role as a convener and help connect you up. There are some great ideas in recovery of the communications sector in Puerto Rico. I was hired by RAND to be one of 2 outside reviewers of their report on the underpinnings of the Puerto Rico communications sector recovery plan. They made some